Hey everyone, have you ever thought about the question, who or what am I? I mean, what is the human self? Am I an actual personal self, or maybe something more like just a moist computer? We continue today in the series A Defense of Christian Belief on the general subject of is there a God? And much of what we are looking at is the support for the very general premise of transcendence, talking about the metaphysical. Somebody can say to me, Eric, wait, this is limited. You're not even talking about the Christian God, and you would be correct. In previous segments, I've prefaced this as such. So be encouraged to watch the whole series as it builds on itself from the previous segments and the numerous installments to come. Now, using abductive reasoning, meaning inference to the best explanation, in what's sometimes called natural theology, which in apologetics would be based on Romans 1, 20 to 21, we've looked at these subjects. Cosmologically, talking about ultimate origins, we've looked at how evidence infers a transcendent or metaphysical cause. Teleologically, pertaining to design, we've looked at how evidence infers this transcendent cause is intelligent. So today we look at sort of a subset subject of design of human life where inference can be made from evidence regarding human consciousness. We concluded last time contrasting perspectives where as humans describing ourselves, is it more fitting or more likely to be truthful saying, I am the result of unguided random mutations, like a Darwinian naturalism, or I am fearfully and wonderfully made, like it says in the Bible in Psalm 139, which could be called a design statement. But we left off with the question, who or what is this I making the statement? So this segment is an attempt to present inferences of what could be said about this and the evidence that supports them. Know again, this is Valley Baptist University. So this is going to be a very heady subject. If you have to get a cup of coffee right now, go ahead and do that. I've put in countless hours of reading, research, and listening to lectures on this, and I'm attempting to summarize this in a structure in a way that's palatable to you as a viewer and listener. One of the premier scholars on this subject is Dr. J.P. Moreland, who, among other things, has been named one of the most 50 influential philosophers in the world today. And I was fortunate enough to have him at our church twice, with the first time involving the presentation of the content of this book. It's just called The Soul. More recently, he finished and released a book that's like his magnum opus. It was co-authored with a former student, Brandon Rickaba, and together they authored the book, The Substance of Consciousness. So these are a couple of primary sources for this study, but there are others as well. And these explore the question, who am I, as it relates to the discipline known as the philosophy of the mind. In Christian apologetics, this refers to the subject of God and consciousness. So, again, previously on inference to the best explanation, I inferred there is a transcendent cause. 2, this transcendent cause is intelligent. Today we're going to build on this argument that this transcendent intelligent cause is a conscious being. Now, how would we get from the subject of human consciousness to the existence of a transcendent conscious being? How are these categories even framed? Right off, I want to make an opening statement that's made even in a negative way, but it's a good premise to build on. Number 1, I am not merely identical to my brain. Number 1, I, and of course I would say you as a human Homo sapien, I am not merely identical to my brain. See, the staunch naturalist, or just the pure physicalist, holds that everything, all of reality, is merely an arrangement of physical matter, including human bodies and brains. So the staunch physicalist holds that even our thoughts, what some call minds, are reducible to a mere arrangement of physics and chemistry. Someone who is a self-described dualist, like J.P. Moreland, or another example would be of the brand of Norm Geisler. This kind of dualist says the body and the brain and the self, the I, are intimately connected but do not correspond to each other in a one-to-one manner. In other words, the brain and the self are not exactly identical. Dean Zimmerman describes this mere substance dualism in this way. He says, for every person who thinks or has experiences, there is a thing, a soul, a spiritual substance that lacks many or most of the physical properties characteristic of non-thinking material objects like rocks and trees, and that this soul is essential to the person and in one way or another responsible for the person's mental life. For this kind of dualist, it's appropriate to say, I have a body and brain, but I am a soul. One could even say that the soul is limited by the body when they are united, but the soul can exist apart from the body. Dr. Moreland uses the analogy of a driver in a car. He says, just like where the driver is seatbelted in or even locked into the car, and the driver is limited by what the car can do while in the car. Is the car fast or slow? Does it have good steering or bad brakes? Even still, nobody would say the driver is merely identical with the car. Now, one caveat on this, people will ask, well, then how is it possible that a person who's brain damaged can have a different personality? Well, keep in mind, the vehicle can be broken. But studies have even shown that the influence of the self, the conscious self or the soul, can actually reconfigure brain chemistry. There's countless studies that verify that. Also, I want to give this side note. This is kind of insider's language. For my Christian friends watching this who have studied these categories, this does not necessitate a Platonic dualism from the thinking of the philosopher Plato, or even a Cartesian dualism from the thinking of Descartes with the ghost in the machine perspective. And those have numerous implications that we would not adhere to as Christians, like our physical bodies being almost expendable or even irrelevant to our identities. What we're looking at is more akin to an Aristotelian or Thomistic dualism from the thinking of Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, or even before that from the teaching of the Hebrew Old Testament, which is sometimes described by Norm Geisler and others as hylomorphism, where just like from a biblical standpoint, there is a distinction between body and soul, but there remains a form-matter unity where the soul animates the body, and they are meant ultimately to be unified and will be in complete final recreation. Also, this still affirms the body along with nature as being inherently good, though they are flawed, and yet there can still be, like the Bible alludes to, this state of the soul being absent from the body. Both Paul and Jesus in the New Testament allude to this. So, back to a summary of the initial premise, which was number one, I am not merely identical with my body and my brain. Now, building on that, why would we think that? Okay, number two, because we are directly acquainted with ourselves, our soul, in states of consciousness. We are directly acquainted with ourselves and our soul in states of consciousness. In support of this, letter A, The data supports this as widespread common sense intuition. Now, there are countless competing definitions of what consciousness is, with very little agreement. In fact, this has actually been called an embarrassment to science to not have an agreed upon working definition of consciousness. Physicalists, atheists like Daniel Dennett go so far as to label conscious experience as merely an illusion. The dualists, however, will point out that we can describe consciousness by ostension, meaning pointing to various kinds of example experiences and their commonalities. This way of framing and supporting reality by conscious ostension is actually very common. Even the atheist Bertrand Russell admitted that all knowledge depends on our direct acquaintance with reality. And so the dualists would say this includes consciousness. John Perry, who is a philosophy of the mind professor at Stanford, he honestly admits when it comes to being a defeater of the distinct soul consciousness, he says physicalism just seems crazy. David Papineau, a graduate of Cambridge and professor of King's College London, said, "Indeed, I would say there is a sense in which even professed philosophical physicalists," he said, including myself, he said, "we cannot fully free ourselves from this intuition of distinctness," a remarkable admission. He says, "We deny dualism in our writings, but when we aren't concentrating, we slip back into thinking of conscious feeling as being something extra to the brain." Now, these types of intuitive feelings people experience, these are called dualist seemings. And research has revealed common sense dualist and dualist seemings are very common even among consciousness researchers. Think about that. Researchers who are denying dualist existence, they are denying it while experiencing it at the same time. So, there is direct acquaintance with ourselves, our soul, in states of consciousness. Letter A, it's a common sense intuition. Letter B, very fascinating. Research has shown that children are by their very nature dualists. Neuropsychologist Paul Broks says belief in dualism is a primordial condition. He says the research reveals we are natural-born soul makers. H.M. Wellman says this. He says our data argues clearly that the first understanding of mind is one of ontological dualism. There's other studies that reveal that young children have a common sense conception of agents as compounds of body and soul. Now, there is a very common question that can be asked about this. Isn't this just social conditioning? I mean, isn't it because so many people believe in God and kids are raised in Sunday school that, of course, they would believe that there is such a thing of the soul? Get this. Researchers Baring and Bjorklund have actually presented the data that this belief of the soul does not come through social learning. In fact, Jason Barrett, in a book entitled Born Believers, The Science of Children's Religious Belief, he states that this substance dualist type of belief in the soul is among the most widespread supernatural beliefs. He says it takes place even in places that claim to be atheistic. In my own life, as my own testimony, I distinctly remember as an elementary school kid in East Bakersfield in our county, I remember thinking on the playground and then back at home, having these thoughts that are what could be categorized as dualist seemings. I remember walking around going, isn't it interesting that I am me? Now, not everybody has maybe thought that way as kids, but I look back on that and that's just a kind of daily common sense perspective that we don't often think about. So we are aware of ourselves by A, common sense intuition, B, even children by their nature reveal this, and C, put very simply, the most common way of addressing our experiences is in the first person. Think about it. When you go home today, or if you came home from work, you would not say, this body and this brain spent the day working, and now this body and brain will relax and listen to music. No, you don't say that. You say, I spent the day working, and now I will relax and listen to music. Now, let's go back to the main points. The main number points that we're looking at here is 1, I am not merely identical to my brain. 2, we are directly acquainted with ourselves and souls in states of consciousness. And we had some subpoints supporting that, which leads us to number 3. Very importantly, number 3, the existence of a self and soul is foundational to the freedom of the will and culpability. In other words, being culpable or accountable for our actions. As a summary of why this is so, think of it like this. If everything in my body is merely behaving according to laws of chemistry and physics, then my brain and body are just responding to whatever input happens to them. So I don't really have the freedom to transcend this, to act truly free, if I am just reducible to the laws of chemistry and physics. You may or may not notice this, but academic circles who subscribe to a very staunch materialism, they will claim there's no true freedom of the will. But when they leave the classroom, they betray their views through their actions. There could be a staunch naturalist, maybe even an atheist, college professor who will just say, humans have no actual free will. It's all mere determinism, responding to the rearrangement of properties. But then, God forbid, something like this happens. His daughter gets raped and murdered. And the same professor is asking for a confession, for repentance, and seeking out justice. He confronts the perpetrator, maybe even in court, and he says, you should be ashamed of yourself. It begs the question, doesn't it? Who is the you being addressed? I mean, the same professor might have just lectured on the premise, humans are a mere composite of physics and chemistry whose actions are determined by the mere arranging of physical properties, and suddenly, now the perpetrator is being referred to as a self who is a responsible soul, which is, of course, this whole dualist position. So number 1, I'm not merely identical to my brain. Number 2, we are directly acquainted with ourselves and our souls in state of consciousness. Number 3, the existence of a soul is foundational to the freedom of the will and culpability. Now number 4, and this is a very trigger button subject, but number 4, near-death experiences, or NDEs. NDEs bear evidence of the continuance of the soul's existence apart from the body. Now, granted, there is much chicanery related to this subject. In our social media and YouTube era, I realize it seems like everybody and their friend, maybe even everyone and their dog, has been beyond and back and seen everything from heaven to hell to reincarnation to parallel universes, or even Elvis. And people who know me well know I am the absolute last one to have buy-in to just mere anecdotal storytelling. However, before these kinds of testimonies were so ubiquitous in pop culture and long before the advent of the internet, people like cardiologist Michael Sabum, who began as an utter skeptic about these kinds of testimonies, he started researching and became very convinced of the veracity of numerous testimonies of those who, when as souls outside of the body, presented facts which could not have been known and their testimonies are corroborated by numerous witnesses. In fact, Sabom has written several books on this, including documentation from his own patients' firsthand experiences. Gary Habermas has also done extensive research on this subject. He co-authored a book with Dr. J.P. Moreland about this, and he gives special credence to evidential cases. He doesn't accept all of them. He doesn't even accept most of them. But he gives special credence to cases where observations are reported at a distance and even in the absence of heart or brain activity. In fact, Habermas notes that for these NDEs, near-death experiences, it's not the detailed tenets of Christianity that are at stake. See, because some people might claim things that are very different from a Christian worldview. They're dancing with Elvis and all this stuff. Erwin Lutzer even addresses this, pastor of Moody Bible Church for years, in a little book called 30 Seconds After You Die, from a theologian's perspective. He says it's not the description of the passageway, but the destination that's of the detailed concern for the biblical Christian worldview. And Habermas states, if looking at this in just general terms, actually evidence, at least in the initial moments of afterlife, seemingly creates havoc for the tenets of naturalism and its claims that this universe composes all of reality. John Hagen is a medical doctor. He wrote a book, The Science of Near-Death Experiences. In his book, every single article was previously published in medical journals. And to summarize Hagen, he states in North America alone, estimates indicate that there have been reported up to 20 million near-death experience phenomena of some sort. And he said if you extend it to Europe, it's up to 30 million people. Now, you say to me, Eric, do you believe all of those? No. Do you believe half of those? No. I don't even know if I believe that 1/10 of those are actual. But here's the crux of this. For the sake of whether there is such a thing as a metaphysical reality, all it takes is just one of those testimonies to be objectively true, to be verified, and then staunch naturalism as a worldview falls. And the data is overwhelming with testimony of this and other kinds of testimonies related to these kinds of dualist seemings. So let's move on to number 5. A lot of people try to inject this concept of emergence into this. Now, this is a kind of heady subject, but number 5, using the word emergent doesn't resolve the dilemma. There is a view that consciousness is metaphysical. Think of what's being said. Consciousness is metaphysical, but it's emergent. It exists within a person having emerged or come into a being as a result of natural processes. In other words, the metaphysical or supernatural just happens from the natural. J.P. Moreland, as you might guess, says it is a question-begging and ad hoc argument to adjust naturalism to allow that material structures of themselves can give rise to consciousness. As we've looked at several times in previous segments, this adjusted naturalism is really a backdoor complement to our worldview that infers the existence of the metaphysical. Someone says there is no evidence for the supernatural. Well, how do you explain 1, 2, 3? Oh, well, we have adjusted naturalism. All right, number 6. And this is a subject that I know is a trigger for a lot of people and very popular in pop culture. The subject of artificial intelligence. Number 6, artificial intelligence will never create true consciousness. Now that is a provocative statement, and we'll see if my statement in this video ages well. Artificial intelligence will never create true consciousness. See, here's the thing. Attempts are being made to present the analogy for emergence through the example of artificial intelligence. There is a lot of optimism that AI is going to result in the emergence of what you could call self-aware robots. Now, There are a ton of semantic games being played with this. Robert Marks is a distinguished professor of engineering and Department of Engineering of Computer Science at Baylor. He worked in the field of artificial intelligence for more than 3 decades. His research support includes NASA, the Office of Naval Research. He's consulted for Microsoft, Boeing, DARPA. This is not just a hayseed Baptist preacher, okay? He's authored several books and several hundred peer-reviewed journals and conference papers on this subject. He has a recent book out. It's called The Non-Computable You, subtitled, What You Do That Artificial Intelligence Will Never Do. A fascinating book. I highly recommend it. One of the things he puts in this category that you do that artificial intelligence never will is experiencing true self-awareness. Listen to what Mark says. He says, let's focus on the seductive semantics of the term self-aware. He says, Oxford tells us self-aware means having conscious knowledge of one's own character and feelings. He says, but computers have no character and no feelings. So we can rule out that definition for anything to do with AI. He says, yes, in a more general sense, self-aware could mean being aware of our surroundings. But he asks, does placing sensors on a car cause the car to be self-aware? He says, these semantics are misleading. He says, my car is not self-aware. There is no self in the car that experiences awareness. Electronic sensors can generate information about the car's position, but the car is not experiencing it. And he says the same is true of this iconic, now squid-like robot. Someone else that he quotes, Sir Roger Penrose, an eminent English thinker and scholar, PhD at Cambridge, Nobel Prize winner in physics. Penrose holds consciousness is not algorithmic. In other words, computers only do what they are programmed to do by humans, and those programs are all algorithms, which are step-by-step procedures contributing to the performance of some task. And he says in the world of programmers, algorithmic and computable are often used interchangeably. And since algorithmic and computable are synonyms, so are non-computable and non-algorithmic. So anything non-algorithmic is non-computable and beyond the reach of AI. He adds on to this self-awareness subject by interjecting the subject of qualia. Qualia are experientially sensory perceptions such as pain, taste, and smell. He says this, Marx puts it this way, if you can't formulate an algorithm explaining your lemon biting experience, you can't write software to duplicate the experience in a computer. Now again, strong AI proponents argue, well, it will just emerge. In other words, consciousness will just happen. It's sort of the natural outgrowth of the code's increasing complexity. And Marx says such unfounded optimism is like this. He says it's like a naive young boy standing in front of a large pile of horse manure. He becomes excited and begins digging in the pile, flinging handfuls of manure over his shoulders, saying, with all this horse poop, he says, there must be a pony in here somewhere. And strong AI proponents similarly claim, in essence, with all this computational complexity, there must be consciousness here somewhere. Marx says there is. He says it's the consciousness residing in the mind of the human programmer. But consciousness doesn't reside in the code itself. It doesn't emerge from the code any more than a pony will emerge from a pile of manure. There's no pony in the manure. There's no consciousness in the code. And along with this, though, so people will say, what about whole brain emulation? I mean, we're going to just upload people's brains onto a computer in the future. Marx says, no, the deal breaker for whole brain emulation is that much of you, again, is non-computable. This fact nixes any ability to upload your brain in a computer. only our algorithmic part can be uploaded, and an uploaded entity that is totally algorithmic, lacking the non-computable, would not be a person. So he says, don't count on digital immortality. So we go from another way that people try to answer this. Number 5, good old panpsychism. I want to say this, and we've looked at this in another series. Panpsychism is not a naturalistic worldview. Panpsychism is the idea that the basic components of nature itself are and these natural particles, that these are themselves conscious. And think about this again. Another backhanded compliment is what this is to the argument for the metaphysical nature of consciousness. In fact, J.P. Moreland says this in his argument in the Blackwell Companion article. He says, the vast majority of consistent naturalists take panpsychism to be a rival to naturalist understanding of matter and not a permissible version of naturalism. You see, someone will say, well, there's no supernatural, there's no divine. But then they ascribe divine characteristics to nature. In other words, they say, well, but nature is eternal, nature is purposeful, nature is intelligent. And in this case, oh, well, nature is conscious. As we looked at in another series, many panpsychists are actually some variety of either pantheist, panentheist, or some kind of monist, oneist spirituality. It's not naturalism. In fact, there's a growing adherence to this in what used to be called the New Age movement, and now it's being conflated sometimes with the designation Christian, such as what's called progressive Christianity. I encourage you to see another VBU series I did on this called Christianity versus the New Spirituality. So, in light of all this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as makes sense, you might guess that this would be the case. Number 6, and this is very well documented and verified. There are a growing number of philosophers of the mind who are now turning away from standard physicalism. And they are even identifying as dualists of various kinds. This number is actually growing. Even a specifically substance dualism is making a historic comeback. David Chalmers did research on this. He compiled a list of at least 30 noted contemporary scholars who were anti-physicalists, although a number of them would still claim to be some brand of naturalism. And as you can see, as we've looked at, often it just doesn't fit with many of their staunch naturalist presuppositions. It's like they're saying we're anti-physical, but there's still no supernatural, and there's certainly no God. Rickabod Moreland say, look, there are good reasons to think that the naturalists should eschew substance and property dualism, and yet they remain in the naturalist camp. However, there are eminent thinkers and scholars who are not theists who are admitting the implications of this. One of them, Crispin Wright of Oxford University, makes this remarkable statement. He says, if we reject this naturalism, then we accept that there is more to the world than can be embraced with a physicalist ontology. And he says, so we take on a commitment. It can seem to be a kind of eerie supernaturalism. Now, Wright doesn't hold to supernaturalism, but he does understand the implications of rejecting physicalism. Thomas Nagel, an author we've mentioned in previous segments, he says, if irreducible consciousness or souls and selves exist, he said, we must ask what sort of reality could and did give rise to them. Nagel says, theism becomes a major player in that discussion. In fact, you can go back centuries to a famous statesman, the Englishman John Locke, the philosopher and statesman from England who died in 1704. And in the context of building from other arguments like the universe from nothing, in fact, his rationale here looks almost like what we've looked at right in this segment. What's the best explanation of these? Why is there something instead of nothing? There's an eternal transcendent cause. How can matter end up as life? The transcendent cause is intelligent. How is it there's such a thing as consciousness? Listen to Locke. Locke says, if then there must be something eternal, let us see what sort of being it must be. And to that, it is very obvious to reason that it must necessarily be a cogitative being, meaning a meditative, contemplative being, a soul. He says, for it is as impossible to conceive that ever bare incogitative matter should produce a thinking, intelligent being, as that nothing should of itself produce matter. And John Lennox, the Oxford philosopher and scientist, he notes that Locke's position is yet to have had a serious contender. So often with the God of the gaps argument, or if they call this soul of the gaps, so we're working on it. We're getting there. We're going to understand it. Well, it's been worked on since at least 1704. If you're watching this, how long are you going to wait for people to work on it before you understand, as Rickabaugh and Moreland said, consciousness is basic for the theist, but not for the naturalist. So let's do some summary things and then an outro that I think is going to be important. What can we infer is the best explanation of the subject of consciousness? Number one is to just deny its existence. Number one is just denial. That's the staunch physicalist position. Staunch physicalism says particles came from nothing, and through an unguided rearrangement of properties, beings came to exist that have brains which compute, but they are not truly conscious. Consciousness is an illusion. Humans are essentially moist computers. Number one is to deny it. Number two is to say that it just arose. It was emergent. Number two, emergent physicalism. Particles came from nothing, and through an unguided rearrangement of properties, they ultimately just emerged into this metaphysical reality we call consciousness. So number one says deny it. Number two says the metaphysical just came into being from the natural. Number three says it's all spiritual, panpsychism. The natural cosmos had no beginning. There have always been at least conscious particles from which everything else is derived. We ascribe the divine nature to nature itself. So, number one, denial. Number two, it just came into being. Number three, it's all spiritual, was almost like a denial of the physical, which is what many people are doing now, sometimes even in the name of Christianity. Number four, this is the biblical theist Christian position. In the beginning was the Logos, an inference to the spiritual, transcendent, conscious mind. In other words, there was a beginning of the natural cosmos caused by an eternal, transcendent, intelligent, and yes, conscious mind. Someone you might have heard of, the most influential person in the history of humanity, his name is Jesus. He said this in John chapter 4, God is spirit. If God is spirit, is there anything within us that we would realize supports this is true? Yeah, one of Jesus' apostles named Paul said in Romans 1:19 and following, what may be known of God is manifest in them, humans, for God has shown it to them. The God and consciousness apologists would say this is an example of how consciousness points to who we are and hence ultimately who God is as our creator. Verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen and being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. Paul in the text just before this says that people suppress the truth. That's like what we've looked at, where people are experiencing dualist seemings, and even researchers against it are experiencing it but still denying it. So God is a conscious being who transcends nature. Somebody says, no, that can't be. Nothing transcends nature. And yet, as we've looked at, even children have an intuitive understanding of this, realizing that we as humans, we are more than just our physical bodies. Conscious researchers, again, they experience it, even while saying they reject it, that we are more than just our physical bodies. Keep in mind, this position is not that we are God, but that we are made in the image of God, and we have manifested within us intuitively that, like God, we ourselves and our souls transcend nature. The brilliant Oxford Don and author C.S. Lewis said this in The Way to Glory. I've been to the location where he delivered this address at Oxford. He said, nature is mortal. We shall outlive her. He says, when the suns and nebulae have passed away, each one of you will still be alive. In fact, to summarize C.S. Lewis from the book Miracles as a kind of outro to what we're looking at, he says, if our thinking and self-awareness arose merely from matter with no transcendent guidance, he asked the question, why would we think we can even trust our thinking, our minds, to process objective truth? Lewis wasn't the only one to explore this. Of all people, Charles Darwin says roughly the same thing. He says, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. And Alvin Plantinga, the influential Notre Dame philosopher, says whether it's Nietzsche, Nagel, Stroud, Churchland, or even Darwin, he says all non-theists, they seem to concur that naturalistic evolution gives one a reason to doubt that human cognitive faculties produce, for the most part, true beliefs. And yet, you and I function every day as though our brains are trustworthy, even as though they're designed to process truth. If someone's pushing back on all these ideas I just presented in this video, you realize that your very pushback right now, as you're commenting in YouTube, your very pushback bears evidence that you think your brain really can't process truth. You're confirming the argument itself. Even if somehow in a physicalist worldview we can trust our thinking, but there is still no true conscious self, it's only just an illusion, like Daniel Dennett and others have said. The further implications of this are noted by materialist Francis Crick. Listen to what Francis Crick says. He says, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity, how important is that to people right now? He says your personal identity and sense of that and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. In fact, more bluntly, Crick wrote an article for a journal with this title, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." Now, even Crick eventually softened this. He softened it, realizing the implications. He said, okay, in the article, you're largely the behavior of a vast population of neurons. You see, a theme touched on to some degree in this segment, even if somebody still lands in the vicinity of one of the first two statements we looked at, staunch physicalism, emergent metaphysicalism, panpsychism, here's some questions. Then why the anger at injustice? Have you noticed anyone angry at injustice lately? Yeah, it's ubiquitous in our world, isn't it? Why the anger at injustice? Or you could say, why frame our understanding of the cosmos and daily life in moral terms. Somebody says, I'm just incensed. I'm incensed at the person who murdered my daughter. Wait a minute, you're incensed at a pack of neurons? Oh, well, okay, yeah, that person had brain damage. I'm actually more incensed at the judge and jury that let the person off. So you're incensed at a court gathering of packs of neurons? Well, you don't understand. If he gets out, he'll do it again. Oh, so you're concerned about the well-being of other future packs of neurons. See, people don't think about what they're saying and how it comports with their claimed view of reality. Why the anger at injustice? Why frame our understanding of the cosmos and daily life in moral terms? Thankfully, that's exactly what we're going to be exploring in the next segment, and we will see you next time. Thanks for being with us, and we'll look for you next on VBU, A Defense of Christian Faith.